Let me be your servant, let me be as Christ to you. Pray that I may have the grace to let you be my servant too. We are pilgrims on a journey, we are travelers on the road. We are here to help each other walk the mile and bear the load.
In last week's text, Naomi told Ruth to go and present herself to Boaz and wait and see what Boaz would tell her. And of course she did that, but then she did more than she was told to do. She just couldn't help herself. She blurted out, "Hi, I'm Ruth, will you marry me?" And in response, she really got more than she expected, because he gave her a blessing and in fact promised to do what he could do to honor her request. But this morning a complication arises in the text. Remember, this whole marriage deal is based on an ancient Jewish custom called levirate marriage. And at its heart, what it means is that if a man dies without leaving a male heir, his widow will marry one of his brothers, and together they will bring up a son in honor of the dead brother, so that the name of the dead brother doesn't die out in Israel. Well, apparently by the time of Ruth, it had extended beyond just the immediate family. Because I don't think that either of these men in the story are blood brothers to Elimelech. I know they're not blood brothers to Ruth's husband, because his brother died as well. So apparently they had extended it through custom to include maybe uncles, maybe cousins, and they seem to have had a pecking order about this that determined who was next in line to marry the widow and take care of her in that way. Well, the complication for Boaz was that he was a kinsman redeemer to Ruth, but he was not the kinsman redeemer to Ruth. Meaning that there was someone who was more closely related to her who was next in line to take her hand and redeem the property of Elimelech. And Tony, I'm sorry I had you start one verse too late, so if you look at verse 12, it'll kind of tie it all together. Verse 12, Boaz says, "It's true that I am thy near kinsman, howbeit there is a kinsman nearer than I." And that's the complication. He's got to deal with this guy who's closer in line in the pecking order, who really is next in line for Ruth's hand. This morning I'm going to show you three things in this story. First, we're going to see the promise of Boaz. Second, we'll see the protection of Boaz. And third, we'll look at the patience of Ruth. Let's look first at the promise of Boaz. Remember, Ruth has just asked Boaz to marry her. And instead of giving a simple yes I will or no I won't, he gives her a promise. The promise is, I will marry you if I can. Now, he was not prevaricating. He was dealing with a legal issue. And the legal issue is that you got this nearer kinsman. And apparently in Jewish custom, that was a strong custom. And what really strikes me about Boaz here is he's not willing to step in front of the next guy, regardless what his feelings for Ruth were, and we really don't know. But there's a standard, and the standard is that he is not next in line, and this really isn't his to claim. Now put it all back in context. Remember, Boaz had a busy day threshing grain. He'd had a nice meal, he'd cleaned up, he'd gone to bed, he was sound asleep, and suddenly he's wakened in the night and he's startled. His feet are cold and there's someone in that threshing floor with him. He says, "Who are you?" She says, "I'm Ruth. Will you marry me?" And he's still rubbing the sleep out of his eyes when he says, "Well, Ruth, I might like to do that, but there's a problem. The problem is that there's another kinsman nearer in line than I." You know, the fact that he had that ready answer in his mind, he knew there was a closer kinsman, makes me wonder if he hadn't already thought about that before. Because it seems top of mind. It makes me wonder if in fact he didn't have feelings for Ruth, and he might have pursued a relationship with her. But it kind of raises the question, if he did, why didn't he pursue a relationship with her? Why did she have to initiate it? Well, this verse may be the answer. Because legally, he was not next in line. Legally, this next kinsman, this nearer kinsman, was one who had the right. And I think this says something about the integrity of Boaz. Because Boaz is going to do the right thing. Even if he had feelings for Ruth, even if he wanted her for himself, he was willing to defer that in order to do what was right. And what really strikes me here is that the integrity of Boaz kind of puts in question the integrity of Naomi. Do you think Naomi knew about this nearer kinsman? Well, surely she did. She sure knew about Boaz, didn't she? So if that was the case, why did she tell Ruth to present herself to Boaz if she knew there was a nearer kinsman? Well, I think that she's kind of fallen for Boaz herself and thinks, hey, this would be a good son-in-law for me, and so go after him. So I really question the integrity of Naomi in this. Something else I want you to notice about the promise of Boaz is that he makes this whole marriage thing sound like a commercial transaction. I'm just going to paraphrase the verses that Tony read a few moments ago in plain English. What he says is, Ruth, we can't do anything about this tonight. Lay down, get some sleep. In the morning, I'll talk to the other kinsman. If he wants to marry you, fine. I'll step out of the way and he can. If he doesn't want to marry you, fine. I'll step up to the plate and I'll take care of it for you. Well now, that's really romantic, isn't it? So you can almost hear Ruth saying, well, thank you, Boaz. I love you too, sweetheart. Where is the romance in this story? Where is the love in this story? Boaz makes it sound like just a cold, legal transaction. Well, the reality is, that's how Ruth had approached it. She wasn't pursuing romance here. She wasn't pursuing a love relationship. She had a legal right to claim Boaz as her kinsman redeemer, and she was pursuing her legal rights. I don't doubt she had feelings for the man, but this story was not driven by her feelings. This story was driven by the legal rights that she was trying to pursue. And again, everything about this story is odd to us. We have no way of really understanding the concept of a kinsman redeemer, and the levirate marriage thing is really foreign to us. And we look at this and kind of throw up our hands. It's even a stretch for us to try to even understand it. But we've got to understand that to know what's going on here in the book of Ruth. Ruth was acting according to the custom, according to the law of Moses, and the fact is that marriage in that time was driven more by logic than it was by love. And I'm going to make bold and say that across the world today, more marriages are driven by logic than are driven by love. And the reason I make that statement is this. Did you know that 55% of marriages worldwide are arranged marriages? Do you know in India, 90% of marriages are arranged? The parties, the bride and the groom, have nothing to say about it. Usually it's arranged by the mom and dad. When I worked at Sprint, I was teaching a class one day, and there was a guy in the class who'd grown up in India. And he was excited because he was going back home in a few weeks to get married. So I said, well, tell me about your bride. He says, well, I never met her. I said, you've never met her? He said, no, my mom and dad worked that out. They worked it out with her mom and dad, and I will meet her the day we're married. I said, well, how's that work? He said, well, about an hour before the ceremony, we'll get to meet. He'll introduce us. We can visit for the next few moments, and if we just don't want to pursue it, we don't have to, but we probably will, because that's how it's done where I came from. How's that for romance, huh? Where's the love there? This is an arranged marriage. And see, arranged marriages are more common worldwide than this love-driven thing that we have in the United States. Throughout Asia and Afghanistan and Africa and in Orthodox Jewish homes, it's very common that mom and dad selects who the couple is going to marry. Now, I'm not advocating for arranged marriages. I married for love almost 38 years ago, and I'd do it again in a heartbeat. So I'm not saying this is bad. I'm just saying that's the world in which Ruth lived. And it's really the more common way that things are done, even in our world. We just don't understand that or appreciate it because that's not our culture. In fact, we are the outliers. We're the ones who are kind of weird according to the rest of the world. But you know what's interesting is, in cultures where they have arranged marriages, marriages have a much higher rate of survival. In the United States, where everybody I know in the United States who got married chose who they were marrying. I mean, I don't know anybody in this country whose mom and dad picked out the bride or the groom. Do you? Yeah, that's just how we do it over here. And yet here, where marriages are arranged because of our love for each other, our divorce rates are astronomically high. Depending on who you read and how they determine the numbers, the divorce rate is anywhere from 30 to 40 to 50%. In India, on the other hand, where 90% of the marriages are arranged by parents, anybody want to guess what the divorce rate is in India?
10%.
I'm sorry?
10%.
That's too high.
Oh.
It's just slightly more than 1%. Yeah, wow. You see, we sit here and think this arranged marriage thing, that could never work. Oh yeah? Seems to work a lot better than what we do. And again, I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying that's the way it is in most of the world, and it does work. In my study, I came across research by a guy named Robert Epstein. He is a senior research psychologist at the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology. Can you remember, imagine having that on your business card? Hi, what do you do? Well, I'm the senior research psychologist at the American Institute for Behavioral Research and Technology. Whew, that's a mouthful. He's also an Orthodox Jew, and he has studied extensively arranged marriages. He says the problem with love-driven marriages is that love is an emotion, and emotions change. And when that emotion changes, sometimes along with it goes the marriage relationship. Here's what he said. I'll read straight from his words. He said, "We grow up on fairy tales and movies in which magical forces help people find their soulmates with whom they effortlessly live happily ever after." Well, isn't that what Hollywood tells us? How many of you have found that getting along with your spouse is effortless? Takes work, doesn't it? Who's raising their hand? He's trying to raise her hand. Look at that. Raise your hand, woman. Maybe the arranged marriages has a different perspective that we need to have. And that is that infatuation and love is a great thing to bring us together. But to stay together, you've got to have a stronger foundation than that. What you really need to have is a commitment to one another that transcends the emotions for one another. I'll come back to that thought in just a few moments. There are issues with this love-driven thing. The church where I pastored previously was right along, well, at the time it was 71 Highway, now it's I-49. I still have to think about it before I can even say it. But it's very visible from the road. Every time you drive through Belton, if you look to the east, you'll see it. I mean, it's right there. And because of its visibility and easy accessibility, it's really the target for a lot of people with their hands out. You know, it wasn't at all unusual to have people just drop in during the day and ask for all kinds of things. I mean, I can tell you lots of stories. A guy came in one time and said, "I'm hungry." I said, "Well, we got a food pantry downstairs. We got a kitchen. Go do what you want to do. Fix yourself some lunch." And you know, he did. He went down there and he fixed whatever we had in the pantry. He fixed it, he ate it, he cleaned it up, and he left. And I always thought, man, that's the way to do it. It's not just want a handout. I'll fix it, I'll clean up. Anyway, we had a lot of people drop in who wondered if we would do their wedding for them. In my 16 years at that church, I really think I declined more marriages than I actually did. Because I'm not in the marriage business. Now, don't get me wrong, I love doing weddings. It's one of my favorite things to do. But I'm not just a wedding guy for hire. I mean, I'll do a wedding for people I know, but just you walking off the street and want me to do your wedding, I got to know a few things about you. So this couple came in, and he was a big guy. He was a lineman for the utility company. And they sat down, and by that time I had developed a list of screening questions I asked before I would commit to one way or the other. And the question I asked them was, what would it take to make you divorce one another? And what really surprised me was how quickly they answered. The answer didn't surprise me, it just came like that. What would it take to make us divorce? Well, if we fell out of love with each other, we'd get divorced. Well, I can almost guarantee you they were going to fall out of love with each other at some point. Because love is an emotion, and it waxes and it wanes. And if your foundation for your relationship is just emotional love, that's not a very strong foundation. What I like about this story with Ruth is, love's not the question. The question is, am I committed to this relationship? And it just seems like, as you read this story, that however it works out tomorrow morning, they're going to make it work. Because they have a different understanding of marriage, I think, than we have. We've made the notion of romantic love so important in marriage that we've lost sight to the commitment to love one another regardless. You know that old wedding vow? For richer, for poorer, in sickness and health, for better, for worse, to love and to cherish till death do us part. That's the commitment. And I just got to think, Ruth and Boaz understood that a little better than some of us in our culture do. Okay, that's the promise of Boaz. The promise is, Ruth, I'll do it if I can, but we got this other guy we got to deal with. So there's the promise of Boaz. Let's look next at the protection of Boaz. Boaz protected Ruth in three ways. First, he protected her physically. Notice the beginning of verse 13. He says, tarry this night, so make yourself comfortable, we'll spend the night here. Well, now wait a minute. Why didn't he just send her home? You don't sleep in the threshing floor, Ruth, and you shouldn't be here anyway, so you just go home and I'll touch base with you in the morning. I'll tell you why he didn't do that. Because the story of Ruth took place during the time of the Judges. By show of hands, how many of you have ever read the book of Judges? Knowing what you know about the book of Judges, would you send your fiancée walking home by herself in the middle of the night? That might not be the smartest thing you could do. It would be kind of like living in South Chicago and sending your fiancée across South Chicago, not even in the middle of the night, by herself in the day is dangerous enough. So he was protecting her. He protected her physically. He protected her morally. Now think about the situation that they are in. You have a young, apparently very attractive young woman who is fragranced. She's probably wearing a new dress. You got this, I don't know, older guy. How old he is, I don't know, but he worked hard in the fields that day, and he got cleaned up and had a good meal and has slept for a couple of hours. And they're talking marriage. It's the middle of the night, in the threshing floor, just the two of them. You think there might have been some temptations to do things they shouldn't be doing there? Maybe to just go ahead and consummate the relationship right now? I think there might have been. And that's why I appreciate some of the verbiage that Boaz uses here. I'm going to give you a lesson in Hebrew vocabulary here. Notice verse 13. The King James says, tarry here. Now that translates the Hebrew word loon, which has absolutely no sexual connotation. In fact, it's the same word that Ruth used when she told Naomi, whether thou lodgest, I will lodge. Where you tarry, I will tarry. Where you stay, I will stay. It's just a generic word. I'm going to stay there. Hebrew, like English, has another word for lay. The word is sakab. It can be a very innocent word, as in, now I lay me down to sleep. But it can also have a gross, crude sexual connotation, as in, somebody got laid. What's interesting to me is that Boaz does not choose that word. I mean, it would fit, lay here for the night, but that could be misconstrued. Instead, he chose the one that has no other definition to it. He's very precise because he's protecting her morally as well. I really like the way the King James has translated this. Verse 13, tarry this night, it shall be in the morning, if he will perform unto thee the part of the kinsman, well, let him do it. If he won't, then I will. And verse 14 is really what I wanted. She lay at his feet until the morning. That's a good translation of the text. You know, I really like the Net Bible because I read from it a lot, and it's kind of it's just kind of become my favorite translation of the Bible. But this one, once in a while, it just throws me. And I think, where did they get this notion? And if you're reading the Net Bible, what you read in there is, she slept beside him until morning. Well, that paints a whole different picture, doesn't it? Sleeping beside someone is not the same as sleeping at someone's feet. But where they came up with that is just a mystery to me. I mean, I dug into this and I just can't see it. That's not what the text says. The text says she laid at his feet till morning, which was the proper place because they were not married and she had no business laying beside him till morning. Okay, enough of that. He protected her morally. He protected her physically. He protected her morally. And the third thing is he protected her reputationally. Notice again verse 14. She lay at his feet until the morning, and she rose up before one could know another. And he said, let it not be known that a woman came into the floor. Well, what would people think if they knew that Ruth had spent the night on the threshing floor with Boaz? I mean, you don't need much imagination to figure that out. The rumors would just be flying. So she wakes up before it's light, before one could know another. So maybe they're just the beginnings of dawn. And he says, okay, you got to get out of here, lady. I don't want anybody to see you here. But before he sends her away, he says in verse 15, bring the veil that you have upon you and hold it. And when she held it, he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her, and she went into the city. Now, much has been written about these 6 measures of barley. Fact is, we don't know how much that is. 6 measures of barley is kind of like saying 6 scoops of barley. Kind of reminds me of the old Kellogg's Raisin Bran. Can somebody tell me how many scoops of raisins there are in a package? There you go. 2 scoops of raisins in a package of Kellogg's Raisin Bran. Y'all remember this commercials? Yeah. How many of you don't have a clue what I'm talking about? Yeah, well, okay. That was, if you want to just laugh sometime, go to YouTube and search for 2 scoops of raisins. I mean, some of their commercials are just hilarious. Just funny. But 2 scoops, well, how much is that? Well, it's 2 scoops. Well, how much is that? I don't know. The reason I don't know is they never tell me what they're using for a scoop. Well, maybe, but that's not their commercial. They have a little plastic thing, but you don't know how big it is. Is it 2 cups? Is it 2 tablespoons? I don't know. The same here. It never defines what the measure is. Maybe Boaz had a clay cup that he used to scoop. Maybe he did just what Don did. He took his 2 hands and 6 hands full. I don't know. It really doesn't matter. It just surprises me how much has been written about that. Before you go, here's some barley or wheat, whatever it was he scooped out for her, and now she heads back home to Naomi. So we've seen the promise of Boaz. I'll marry you if I can. We've seen the protection of Boaz. He's protected her physically, morally, and reputationally. Now I want you to see the patience of Ruth. This is verse 16. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi said, who art thou, my daughter? Now, Naomi knows who she is. You think Naomi slept that night? If she did, I bet she tossed and turned. And I bet before it even started to be dawn, she's sitting up in the front room just waiting for this girl to come home and tell her how it went. The question is not, who are you? The question is, hey, who are you? Are you Mrs. Boaz? That's the question here. And Ruth told her all that the man had done to her. And she said, these 6 measures of barley he gave me, for he said to me, go not empty to your mother-in-law. Then Naomi said, sit still, my daughter, until thou know how the matter will fall, for the man will not be in rest till he has finished the thing this day. Now, Naomi assures Ruth that she's done all that she can do. What remains is sit tight and see what happens. What she knew was that by sundown, she's going to be engaged. What she didn't know was, to whom would she be engaged? Would she be marrying Boaz? Or would she be marrying this unnamed kinsman? And did she even know that kinsman? And what's really fascinating is, it appears that Ruth is okay either way. If it's Boaz, she'll learn to love Boaz. She will commit her life to him. If it's this other guy, she'll learn to love this other guy. She will commit her life to him. Romantic love is a wonderful thing. By itself, it is not a good foundation for marriage. It is great for bringing a couple together. It's not always great for keeping a couple together. What we need in addition to the romantic love is the kind of love that says, I'm committed to you whatever the cost. That kind of commitment often generates the other kind of love that we're talking about. You know, when Paul told the Ephesians, love your wives even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. Well, he's talking about how Christ died on the cross for our sins. In that text, he was not talking about a romantic love. Christ didn't feel romance as he died on the cross for our sins. He was demonstrating agape, which is a willful love, a commitment to love, regardless what the other person says or thinks. That's the kind of love God wants us to have for our spouse. That's what Ruth was committed to. And that's why I think Ruth is an example for you and I to follow. So, if you're married, what's the challenge? Dig those foundations deep into a commitment to one another. When you're infatuated, enjoy the infatuation. When the infatuation wanes, you just dig down to that commitment. If you're not married, when you do, make sure you're committed, regardless of the feelings, because the feelings come and go. The commitment stays forever. And that's the lesson I get from Ruth this morning. Let's pray together, shall we? Father, I thank you for this woman, Ruth. It just seems every time I turn back and spend some time studying her, I'm more and more impressed. Impressed with her love for you, impressed with her desire to do your will, impressed with her willingness to do whatever you want her to do, regardless of her own feelings. May she be a challenge and a help to us. And Father, I pray for marriages in this church. I pray they would be strong. And I pray that the married ones would indeed enjoy a romantic and infatuation kind of love. But more than that, may we each have a commitment that transcends the emotions, a commitment to one another, to live for one another regardless how we feel. May our marriages be strong. May they be honoring to you. May we love as Christ loved the church. In his name I pray. Amen.